chapter 2 in both textbooks, it has to do with research in social psychology. Uh, Research is very important to social psychology. It's probably more important to social psychology than any other branch of psychology. It's necessary for them to do a lot of research in social psychology. It's one of the reasons why I have you doing research in the class. It's the same in both classes or both textbooks. So chapter 2 deals with research. There's a reason why social psychology is supported by research, and the reason is because in any society, whether it's European, African, Asian, or from North or South America, the societies that we're dealing with are supported by cultures, and all the cultures are different, and for that reason, the social psychology tends to be skewed in a different direction in all the other societies. So it's very important as far as social psychology is concerned. Now, one of the problems that we tend to have is that we only look at the American society, or we look at Canadian society. Potentially we look at a European society, but probably not. It's real important that we focus on different societies to support social psychology. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. There we go. Research done in social psychology follows the scientific method. And of course, if you're not following the scientific method, then we're not exactly sure if your research is any good. And that's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that psychology is not a hard science, that's one of the reasons why we have to follow the scientific method. Otherwise, the other disciplines that we're dealing with would look at our research and say, well, this isn't accurate at all. So we have to follow the scientific model as closely as we possibly can. Sometimes it doesn't fit very well, but we try to do it anyway. As far as scientific method is concerned, initially we gather information, we analyze the information, and then we interpret the information. The social psychologist first observes a phenomenon, they read existing literature on the topic, and then they develop a theory about the phenomenon. A theory is an integrated set of principles that explains and predicts observed events. So the first thing we do is observe a phenomenon, and then we come up with a theory. Let's take a look at something like loneliness. Somewhere, I have that sheet of paper here somewhere. Loneliness. Since COVID-19, more people are reporting a feeling of loneliness than they were before. This is in the United States. It's not just in the United States, of course. It's all around the world. And one of the reasons is because people were forced to isolate within their own family. And so in many instances, they weren't allowed to leave their house, their apartment, potentially their one room. And they were only interacting with a select group of individuals. And the reason is because they needed to make sure that they weren't being contaminated by outside individuals. So our theory is that loneliness has increased since COVID-19, and we can observe it. We see that it potentially is happening. There are more people that are reporting this. So now we need to do research to determine if this is true. How about that? Okay, that's the research I'm going to be talking about. This is not something that has been done. It's something that I came up with over the summer when I was working in research methods. While basic research can be characterized as research that is not applicable but advances scientific knowledge, applied research increases the understanding of and solutions to real-world problems by using current knowledge. And this is what we primarily do in psychology, where this isn't a basic research, this is applied research. Almost all of psychology bases its research on application. If we can't apply it to something, then why in the world do it? Basic and applied research can inform each other, leading to greater scientific progress. This is especially true in other disciplines, not so much in psychology, because psychology needs to be applicable. We need a reason for doing it. From the theory, the scientist develops hypotheses. Hypotheses are testable propositions that describe a relationship that may exist between events. Hypotheses allow us to test a theory by suggesting how we might try to falsify it. Hypotheses give direction to research. Because hypotheses are predictive, they tend to also be more practical. So the hypothesis in the loneliness research that I am proposing is that since the 2020-2022 pandemic, people are feeling more lonely. That is my hypothesis. Now I have to figure out a way to measure it. Ethical concerns about the study must be addressed, including whether use of deception is justified. And I'm not really planning on using any deception. I'm just going to give people a survey and to find out if they are lonely or not. The institutional review boards protect the safety and the well-being of the study participants because IRBs require adherence to specific guidelines, including the idea of informed consent. And of course, we do have an IRB at Dene College. The Navajo Nation has an IRB. So if I was planning on doing a loneliness study on the Navajo Nation, I would have to go through, if I were doing it at the college, I would have to go through the IRB. I would have to go through the IRB at Dene College, and potentially I'd have to go through the IRB if I were going to do it off campus. I would have to do it, the Navajo Nation, I have to get approval from the Navajo Nation as well. The independent variable is manipulated by the researcher. It is the variable presumed to cause the change to the other variable. The dependent variable is the one measured by the researcher to see if changes depend on the level of the independent variable. And in the case with my loneliness, the independent variable is, let's see, what do I have? The dependent variable, of course, is loneliness. My independent variable would be, are they people going out more, less frequently? Are they communicating less? Are they spending more time alone now that even though COVID is no longer as serious as it was before? We're not seeing as many deaths. Are your plans for the future more isolated? That would be an independent variable. So the three independent variables for my own research dealing with loneliness: are people going out less frequently? Are they communicating less? Are they spending more time alone? And are their plans for the future more isolated than they were before? Those are my four independent variables, and my dependent variable in this case would be loneliness. Okay. The experiment is not just another word for study. It has a particular meaning. The experimenter manipulates the independent variable. They use random assignment to put people in groups or conditions. They measure the dependent variable. Controls they control all other variables as much as possible. And of course, our experiment is going to be a survey, and we're going to ask them about these four independent variables, and we will judge their loneliness from that. The groups are equivalent at the start of the experiment. they experience different levels of the independent variable. They don't experience any other differences because everything else is controlled. So if the groups are different at the end of the study, it can only be because of the difference in the levels of the independent variable. Now this would be true with a certain type of research, but in our case, that's not what we're doing. We're just going to ask people about their level of, we're going to give them a loneliness scale. And there is a loneliness scale out there. Where is it? I have it here somewhere. The loneliness scale is out of UCLA, and it's a 20-question survey, 20-item loneliness scale. Loneliness is measured by the 20-item loneliness scale. Okay, and then we're going to ask them if they're going out less frequently, if they communicate less, if they spend more time alone, and if they have plans, if their plans for the future are in a more isolated situation. Internal validity refers to making sure that nothing else besides the independent variable can affect the dependent variable. This is accomplished by controlling all extraneous variables and by randomly assigning people to different experimental conditions. Internal validity is established by controlling all extraneous variables and by using random assignment to conditions. Let me explain to you a research that I have done in the past. This is research that I was doing when I was working at a pediatrics clinic in Vienna, Virginia. We were trying to determine, what were we trying to determine? We were trying to determine which type of antibiotic worked best on otitis media, or earaches, children coming in with earaches. And of course, this was very common during cold season and during flu season. So we had a whole raft of individuals coming in. And what we did, we gave them different antibiotics. Actually, we gave them an antibiotic and we gave them a placebo. And the reason we did this is because we were trying to determine if the antibiotic was a better way of treating the earache. We were trying to determine if the antibiotic was working. That's what we were trying to do. So we didn't know what level of we had 3 levels of antibiotic, 3 strengths of antibiotic. And we were trying to determine how little we could give them and still cure their otitis media, their earaches. And we also had a placebo. So, and a lot of kids, of course, their immune systems will kick in and they will kill off the bacteria all by themselves. I mean, this is the way it was done. Before we had antibiotics, kids were able to cure themselves of their earaches. And so that's what we were doing. We were giving 3 levels of the antibiotic, 3 different strengths of the antibiotic, plus a placebo. And then at the end of the study, we had so many kids with earaches that year. We had probably 100. And of course, we had no idea which level we were giving them. The ones that got the strongest antibiotic, they all, of course, had no problem knocking out the bacteria. The second one, we also had no problem knocking out the bacteria. The third one, it only cured about 3/4 of them, of the individuals. And the ones that got the placebo, they were still recovering. About 33% were recovering. So we had 100%, 100%, and 75%, and about 33%. Now, one of the things that we did, if somebody got a placebo and it didn't cure, and they didn't take care of their earache, they were given a certain amount of money. It was just kind of an odd situation, and it sounds kind of like torture, but well, wasn't quite that bad. We gave them a week to get over their earaches, and if they didn't respond within the week, to the antibiotic or the placebo, we gave them another type of antibiotic that knocked out the earache, and they were not only given money, but they also, let's see, how did they do that? Oh, they also got free medical care for any ear problems. Okay, and that's what they're talking about. Okay. Internal validity is established by controlling all the extraneous variables and by using random assignment to conditions, and that is what was going on with the antibiotic research. Even with random assignment, there is a small probability that different characteristics of people are distributed differently across conditions. To guard against misinterpreting results, scientists calculate the probability level, or the p-value, that their results would occur by chance. And this is done statistically. It's done mathematically. External validity is the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to other situations and other people. Mundane realism is the extent to which an experiment is similar to real-life situations. Psychological realism is the extent to which the psychological processes triggered in an experiment are similar to psychological processes that occur in everyday life. And of course, we're not going to take people and isolate them and make them lonely so that we can do experiments on them. That is not a good way to do, that's not a good way to conduct anything. Okay, field experiments, more natural setting lead to easier generalization. Less control leads to less assurance about cause and effect. We're never exactly sure what is the cause and effect. With these individuals, one of the things that they had to agree to was not to take any aspirin, ibuprofen, or acetaminophen with their antibiotics. And the reason is because that could have thrown a variable in there that would have changed things. So that was part of it. It was really kind of an interesting study, and there were a lot of people that agreed to do it. Like I said, we had about 100 subjects for that experiment, but about maybe 150, 175 people came, or children came in with ear infections, which sounds like a lot, and it was a lot. It was more than we had had the year before. Lab experiments are unnatural settings, may limit the generalizability. If it's a lab experiment, you bring somebody in and you say, okay, I'm going to isolate you in this chamber to see how your loneliness increases. Easier control leads to stronger causal claim, and of course, that's one of the ways of looking at it. Virtual environment technology, early studies suggest a promising combination of realism and control. Those are the virtual environment technology studies. Web-based studies, they tend to recruit many people. They run studies remotely, cheap and easy, non-representative samples, but so are psych students or any college students. And one of the reasons that psychology professors do a lot of experiments on their students is because it's cheap and it's free. But it tends to be non-representative. If you can think of a classroom full of psychology students, that's really not representative of the general population. For one thing, it tends to be younger. For another thing, it tends to be healthier. We saw this when we were looking at research coming out of the military. Military people tend to be extremely healthy. Yeah, they seem to be extremely healthy and younger than the general population. So you wouldn't be able to compare the military population to a population in, say, Chicago or Detroit of the same age group. The implicit measures are reporting what people don't know they think. Brain imaging techniques are another way of doing this. Okay, science in action. Dr. Belvedere observed that his female students complained about their boyfriends more than they did their husbands, while men complained about their wives but rarely about their girlfriends. So the female students had a problem with their boyfriends, and the male students had a problem with their wives. Dr. Belvedere theorized that women treat men differently when they are dating than when they are married. This made women complain more before the wedding and men to complain more after the wedding, because they were being treated differently when they were married to the individual than the girlfriend was treating them before they were married. Belvedere hypothesized that women believe that if they marry a man, they will be able to change all of his faults. He also hypothesized that men believe that if they marry their girlfriend, things will remain the same as they were when they were dating. Social psychology uses 4 approaches to research. Field research is done in natural, real-life settings outside the laboratory. Laboratory research is done in a laboratory. Correlational research compares 2 or more variables, usually from a field study. Experimental research manipulates 1 or more variables in a controlled setting. So Belvedere decided to do a preliminary meta-analysis study on his hypothesis and found that studies from the 50s and 60s showed that women during that era rarely complained about men. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, after the feminist revolution, the studies showed increasing complaints about men. Belvedere decided to bring a group of subjects into the lab and give them a fictional scenario that the individuals would have to respond to. He discovered that men expected women to try to change them after marriage, and women felt compelled to try to change men. Observational methods. The observational method involves systematic observation and measurement of behavior. Ethnography is a type of observational method used by cultural anthropologists and social psychologists to study and understand a group or culture. Participant observation is a form of systematic observation whereby the observer interacts with the people being observed, but tries not to change the situation in any way. Belvedere's next step was to put together a field study approach. He hired 25 males and 25 females to keep a diary of their conversations over a 2-week period. They were not allowed to steer any conversation toward the topic of male and female interactions. There were not enough episodes of people complaining about the opposite sex to make any determination. So Belvedere decided to allow people to bring the topic up in conversation. In other words, he allowed them to manipulate the variable. Interjudge reliability, the level of agreement between 2 or more people who independently observe and code a set of data. Archival analysis is a form of observational method whereby the researcher examines the accumulated documents of a culture. They look at documented information from the past. When researchers decide to do research, they determine a population that they are going to perform the research on. The population could be as large as the world population or the people taking social psychology at Diné College. A random sample is a survey procedure where every person in the population being studied has an equal chance of inclusion. By only allowing a college or prison population to be surveyed, a researcher is creating an unrepresentative sample. As you can plainly see, college students are different than the general population, as is the prison population, since they're all criminals. Not college students, but the prison population are all criminals. Meta-analysis examines the outcomes of many studies. Meta-analysis is a statistical technique used to combine information from many empirical studies on a single topic to objectively estimate the reliability and overall size of the effect. Meta-analytic researchers strive to include non-published studies to avoid the file drawer effect. File drawer effect is a situation where if the research is negative, the individual tends not to publish it. The reason they don't publish it is because they don't want to admit that they came up with a bad research or with the wrong hypothesis. But of course, you need to publish your failures. And the reason they need to publish their failures is so that someone won't repeat their failure. And that tends to happen because other people have the same ideas that they do or have similar ideas that they do. If they publish their negative research, if they publish their negative results, then the individuals would come up with different hypotheses. They would know, well, this didn't work for them, it probably won't work for me. But since they don't have that information, they go ahead and they try the research anyway. And they get negative results, so they just put it in the file drawer. They just file it, they don't publish it. So one of the things that needs to happen is that negative results need to be published, even though it makes you look like you don't know what you're doing or you came up with a bad idea. Since findings from a single study are less convincing than findings from a series of studies, a meta-analysis can provide a clear statement of the state of research on a certain topic. A researcher can prejudice his sample by using an unrepresentative sample. Other ways of prejudicing the results of the survey include order of questions, limited response options, question wording, demand characteristics, subtle cueing of the participant to answer in a desired way. Now this is really kind of interesting because I'm proposing to use a loneliness scale developed at UCLA, and it's called the UCLA Loneliness Scale. It's a 20-item scale, and it's already been standardized. In other words, they've already determined that the order of the questions is good. They have limited response options. It's either a yes or no, or maybe it's on the Likert scale. I can't remember what it looks like. And of course, the question wording has already been standardized. And there are no demand characteristics in the study, and that's one of the reasons why using someone else's scale, using someone else's survey, or using one that has been published before is a good way to do this type of research. Participant observation is a subset of naturalistic observation. The researcher joins the group being studied as a participant. A classic example of this type of research is the study of a doomsday cult by Leon Festinger and his colleagues in 1956. After infiltrating the cult, Festinger and his colleagues chronicled the cognitive dissonance of the cult leader and followers when the world didn't end the 21st of December, 1956. So they actually infiltrated, they were just observing, they were taking down notes about what was going on in the cult. The world was supposed to end on the 21st of December 1956, and I was alive on the 21st of December 1956, and I can tell you the world did not end on the 21st of December because I was there, and it continued to go on. But they were trying to chronicle the cognitive dissonance. How in the world did they rationalize the fact that it didn't end? One reason that laboratory research is so widely used in science is because variables can be controlled. The variable that is manipulated or controlled by the researcher is known as the independent variable. The variable that is tested or measured is known as the dependent variable. And those are the things that, of course, we talked about the loneliness scale. So our dependent variable in this research that I'm proposing is loneliness. And the independent variable is different aspects that show loneliness, like going out less frequently, communicating less, spending more time alone, and their plans for the future being more isolated than they were before the pandemic. Doing research on people who are not aware what the experiment is about is not ethical. You need to tell them what it's about. So in the case of my research, my loneliness research, one of the things that we would need to tell them is this is research about loneliness, and that is known as informed consent. We need to tell them why we're asking them these questions. Deception is misleading participants about the true purpose of the study. And when you go through some of the research on the social psychology page, you will see that they don't always tell you what's going on. They don't always tell you what they're looking for until the very end. And that's known as deception. And one of the things that they need to do is what they refer to as debriefing. Debriefing is explaining to participants at the end of an experiment the true purpose of the study, and that's what they need to do with deception. One of the classic cases of deception in research was Milgram's experiment with, he was looking for how people react to authority figures. But one of the problems that Milgram had, and this was of course before the whole concept of IRBs, he just did the research. He deceived the individuals into thinking that they were doing educational research. And he didn't debrief them at the end. If he had debriefed them, then probably there wouldn't have been any problems. Could we do it today? Well, probably not, because they caused a lot of distress to the individuals who were in the research. The correlational method involves systematically measuring the relationships between two or more variables. For example, how much one can be predicted from the other. The correlation coefficient is a statistic that assesses how well you can predict one variable from another. And so with my independent variables and loneliness, one of the things I'd be looking for is the fact that they were going out less frequently. Where does this come in on the loneliness scale? In other words, if they used to go out every night, 5 nights a week, and now they're only going out 1 night a week, is their loneliness scale elevated? Of course, the other question that we can't ask them is, what was their loneliness scale before the COVID-19? We can't ask them that question because we can't go back in time. But if we were doing a correlation coefficient, what we would be doing is looking at the figure that we get from the going out less frequently and from the loneliness scale, and we would compare the two, and that's known as a correlation coefficient. We would do the same thing with communicating less. We do the same thing about spending more time alone. We do the same thing. We would compare their plans for the future being more isolated with their loneliness scale. So if people are scoring really high on the loneliness scale, do they have a high level of going out less frequently, a high level of communicating less, a high level of spending more time alone, and a high level of having more isolated future plans? Now, what potentially may be happening is their loneliness is high, yet they're going out the same amount they did before the pandemic. They're communicating just as much as they did before the pandemic. They're spending less time alone than they did before the pandemic, and their future plans are not any more isolated than they were before. It may be that loneliness is just increasing, but we would see that with correlational coefficient. Correlational research assesses the direction and strength of the relationship between variables. Correlational research is designed to examine the nature of the relationship between two or more variables, not controlled by the researcher. Correlations are used for prediction. If you know the value of one variable, you can predict the value of the other. Correlation coefficient measures linear relationship between two variables. The range is plus or minus 1 is plus or minus 1. So it's a range of 2. It goes from minus 1 to plus 1. And in the middle, of course, is 0. Strength is indicated by the magnitude or the absolute value. So the closer to minus or plus 1 it is, the greater the strength. Direction is indicated by the plus or minus sign. So if they are going out, they were going out before 5 times a week, and now they're going out 7 times a week, but their loneliness scale is higher, then it would have a negative correlation. In other words, just because they're going out more frequently than they did before doesn't have anything to do with loneliness. And if we saw that with the majority of the individuals that we did the research on, then it would have a negative result. If we just saw this in some of the individuals, then it would be closer to 0. I hope that makes sense. If their loneliness scale increased and they were going out less frequently now than they were before, then it would have a positive result. So the higher the less frequently they were going out, if that increased with their loneliness scale, then it would be positive. If they're going out more now, and their loneliness scale was even higher than it should have been, it would be a negative result. Anyway, so we do this, we figure the negative correlations and the positive correlations using a scatter plot. And this is a negative correlation. Every time one goes up, the other goes down. That's a negative correlation. This is every time one goes up, the other one goes up. That's a positive correlation. And if it doesn't have any impact at all, then it would be all over the map. And it wouldn't be going in any specific direction. Correlations at or near 0 may mean no relationship between variables or a curvilinear relationship. Social science correlations rarely exceed 0.60 because most behavior is influenced by many different variables, and so isolating one variable causing another variable is very difficult. When two variables are correlated, there is a natural tendency to assume one causes the other. However, there are problems in assuming a cause. A third variable problem, it is very difficult to isolate only 2 variables, and that's what we're talking about here. I've only got 4 variables that I'm dealing, or 5 variables actually, a dependent variable and 4 independent variables. It may be something else that's causing these people to be lonely. Maybe they just broke up with their significant other. You know, that could be make them feel more lonely. Reverse causality problems, which variable is the cause and which is the effect? And that's, you know, are they feeling more lonely, therefore they go out less often? Is going out less often not causing them to be lonely? The loneliness is causing them to go out less often. The correlational method identifies only whether 2 variables are associated and not why they are related. And that's, of course, part of the problem of social psychology. We can have a hypothesis that because we are lonely, people are going out less frequently. That is our hypothesis, but it may be the opposite of that. People are going out less frequently, so they feel more lonely. The correlational method often relies on surveys as well as on observational data. Surveys are used when the variable of interest is not easily observable. Surveys are structured sets of questions used to measure attitudes, beliefs, values, or behavioral tendencies. 4 major survey techniques are face-to-face, written, phone, and computer surveys. And of course, you guys are going to be doing computer surveys when you're looking at the social psychology page, the social psychology research page. I want you to do 10 of them. It shouldn't hurt anybody. There's not very much deception in there, not on a computer survey. Format, delivery system, and question phrasing are aspects of a survey that must be carefully considered. The qualitative method investigates the why and how of social science, or not just what, where, and when. Hence, smaller but focused samples are more often used than large samples. If a researcher could find an instrument that quantified a feeling or idea, they used a Likert or a Likert type scale, it is quantitative research. So anytime, and most of the research you're going to be doing will not be qualitative, it will be quantitative. And the reason it will be quantitative, they're looking for a number. Now this is fairly superficial if you think about it. On a scale of 1 to 10, what is your depression level today? Well, okay, so today I'm a 4. Yesterday I was a 2 because I was happier. Wait a minute. Oh no. So how accurate is this? And of course, psychology uses a lot of these really strange quantitative structures. The Beck's depression inventory. If you go into the emergency room and you say, I'm feeling depressed, I need something to make me feel happier, they will probably give you a Beck's depression inventory. Here lately, every time I go in to see the doctor, they ask me how depressed I am. As odd as that may seem, and of course I have to plot it on a scale of 1 to 5, I guess is what it is. And I always tell them, I'm not depressed at all. I'm a 0. Because of lack of control of variables, it is difficult to impossible to determine cause. All you see is effect. Observer bias is a second problem. So if I were, and this was an interesting situation that happened in Mississippi. When we were stationed in Mississippi, my wife was stationed in Mississippi. I was working at East Mississippi Community College and Mississippi University for women. So I kept getting involved in, let's see, how can I say this? I was being told about different forms of mental illness in the state of Mississippi, and there was quite a bit. There were 2 mental hospitals in the state. One, and this comes from Jim Crow. This comes from back when African Americans had one hospital and the European American population had another. The white population had one and the black population had another one. Now the interesting thing was that the white hospital focused on bipolar disorder, and the African American hospital focused on schizophrenia. So if you were black and you took a test, then it turned out that you were psychotic, then they would assume that your problem was schizophrenia. If you were white and you taking their test, it would turn out that you had bipolar disorder. Now the weird thing was that, of course, if you were schizophrenic, if you were a white schizophrenic person suffering from schizophrenia and you were white, then they would start treating you for bipolar disorder and you wouldn't respond to it. And then they would send you to the other hospital. And it was the same way with in the black hospital. If you were actually bipolar and they started treating you for schizophrenia, you would respond to some extent, but it wouldn't really, you would actually get worse if they treated you for schizophrenia and you had bipolar disorder. So then they'd send you to the other hospital. But this didn't happen very often. What needed to happen was, of course, they needed to diagnose them properly instead of just treating them. And this was observer bias. Because you're white, you can't have schizophrenia, you must be bipolar. It's a really bizarre situation. I had a friend who was African American, and her brother had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she was black. He was black. They were both black. How did that work? But he had, yeah. Well, anyway, it was kind of weird. He had gone to the white hospital first, and they had started treating him for bipolar disorder, didn't work. Well, I'm not going to explain the nuances of race. They were like complexioned, and because of that, he was sent to the White Hospital. It was really kind of bizarre. Preconceived ideas. So observer bias is preconceived ideas held by the researcher affects the nature of the observations made. So if I'm the researcher and I'm doing this loneliness thing, I'm looking for people that are lonely. I'm assuming everybody's lonely. If I'm lonely, then everybody else must be lonely too. And that would be observer bias. There may be people that didn't have any problem with the pandemic. And of course, if I assumed that everybody was like me and they got lonely, then that would be observer bias. The presence of an observer may change the behavior of the sample, and they may not act authentically, but in a manner that they think the observer desires. And this is also a problem. Especially, this was one of the problems that they had on the Indian reservations when they were trying to do research on the Indian reservations. A lot of times, the individuals were trying to do what they wanted them to do. And we had that case in cultural psychology. We talk about a case where an individual went to India, and they were looking at family meals, sitting down for a family meal. Well, in one part of India, they didn't sit down for family meals. The males ate at one time, the females ate at another time, and then they fed the children at that same time. But they never all sat down together to have a family meal. The males never ate with the females. But there was an individual that was coming in from England, and they were researching family meals. So when they contacted an individual from that area of India, and they said, "We're researching family meals." So they assumed that they wanted them to see a family meal. So they set up a scenario where the men and the women and the children were all eating at the same table, which would never, ever, ever happen. I mean, of course, the Brits that came in didn't have a clue what was going on, so they assumed everybody ate the same way they did in England, and of course that was incorrect. They were just trying to make them happy. And they did. They made them happy. They said, "Oh, people in India eat the same way that we eat in England. It must be universal." And of course, the answer is no, it's not, because in a lot of different cultures, the males and females don't eat at the same time. There may be a question of invaded privacy. Well, this is the Milgram experiment, and I'm going to show you a video about the Milgram experiment. I was just talking about this.
In a unique period from the early 60s to the early 70s, a group of social scientists conducted a series of experiments examining the nature of human behavior and its relationship to social conventions and situations.
In this setting, I allow things to be done to me that I wouldn't allow in any other context. The dentist is about to put an electric drill into my mouth. In this setting, I willingly expose my throat to a man with a razor blade.
Stanley Milgram, one of the most influential social psychologists of the time, was particularly fascinated with the dangers of group behavior and blind obedience to authority.
What is there in human nature that allows an individual to act without any restraints whatsoever, so that he can act inhumanely, harshly, severely, and in no way limited by feelings of compassion or conscience? These are questions.
But he might be dead in there. The experiment requires that you continue, please. 330 volts.
The experiments that Milgram and others conducted were controversial, and for ethical reasons may never be conducted again. Yet the results of those experiments remain groundbreaking, profoundly revealing about the tensions between the individual and society, and increasingly relevant to contemporary life. In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an event that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
Look how fast he walks. We
It is
saw that
May
before.
1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven. And while there, they detected a heart condition. Nothing serious, but as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105. Hard hit. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary. What do you mean as far as is necessary?
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But he focused on the darker side of obedience.
Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face.
That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I have heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now.
It's absolutely essential that you continue. You got no other choice, teacher. Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Now, this man makes disobedience seem a very rational and simple deed. Now, other subjects respond quite differently to the experimenter's authority.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts. Please continue.
Some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most, subjects found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically and inappropriately.
50 volts.
Quit. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go. They were in a state of conflict, which was created a tremendous amount of stress. So that was the main critique.
This will be at 3:30.
As his voice began to show increasing frustration, so did I. And I was really in a state of real conflict and agitation. One of Stanley Milgram's basic contributions was that you don't ask people what they would do given this hypothetical situation. You put them in the situation.
Wrong. Up to 180 volts. Please continue, teacher. 180 volts. Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill it.
According to Milgram, one of the things that's a prerequisite for carrying out acts that are evil is to shed responsibility from your shoulders and hand it over to the person in charge.
And who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens to him. Continue, please. Next was slow.
He didn't hold any gun to anybody's head. Just the fact that he conveyed a sense of authority. Roughly 65% of the people went all the way to the top of the chalkboard.
450 volts. That's it. Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue. I'm not getting no answer. Don't the man's help mean anything? Whether the learner likes it or not, but he might be dead in there.
Milgram made the point, I think, very effectively, that the Nazis weren't all a bunch of psychopaths at Belsen and Dachau at the death camp from the middle class in New Haven.
But who was actually pushing the switch? I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going.
What kind of obedience would Milgram get today if he were to do the experiment today?
Probably about the same.
Probably about the same. Why?
I don't know. I think people are just inherently obedient.
It just really shows like how far human beings will go to appease what they perceive to be an authority figure.
Milgram has identified one of the constants, one of the universals of social behavior. The readiness to obey authority cuts across time. It's a constant. The other outstanding and distinctive thing about the obedience experiment is how much it has and keeps on permeating contemporary culture and thought. It's still with us in very, very important ways.
Interesting. Okay. Way to go, Stanley. Questionable practices in research include deception, misinforming the participants about the true nature of the research. This is done so that the responses of the participant is closer to real-world reactions. Confederate, using a trained member of the research team as part of the sample to deceive the participant to act in a certain way. Whoops. Oh, and that is the end of our research. So what happened with, wait a minute, what happened, there we go, okay. Science in action. We didn't finish that. What happened in Belvedere's research? Well, nothing happened in Belvedere's research. He was right. Women want to change men, and men think that women are going to try to change them. As curious as that is. Okay, so that is the end of the chapter, and I'll talk to you again next week. I'm not sure which direction we're going, but that's okay. We'll tackle it next.